Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the Social Simulation Week 2020. And it is my great pleasure to present the Rosario Conte Outstanding Contribution to Social Simulation Award 2020 this year. But before I do, and since there are now so many of you in the room, I would just like to give a huge public thanks to Flaminio Squazzoni and his team for putting on such an excellent show. This has been a real success. I think it's gone very well indeed. So yeah, thank you very much indeed, Flaminio. I hope you're seeing all the claps coming your way, and yeah, here's one from me. Thank you very much. It's really been fantastic. So, on to the more serious business. So I think it's important to tell you a little bit about the award first. This is our most prestigious award that society gives, and it's given to someone who stands out for their contribution to the advancement of social simulation. And this could be through outstanding research in social simulation and their contribution to the social simulation community generally. The award is named in honor of Professor Rosario Conte, who's pictured on the right, who is a pioneer of social simulation and in fact the third president of the European Social Simulation Association. And very sadly, just before our conference in Rome in 2016, she passed away. The first person ever to be awarded this prize is Professor Nigel Gilbert, who I see is present. And in Stockholm, we made the award to Professor Yuri Vilensky. Obviously, both of those people very highly noteworthy for their contribution to the community. This year, it is my very great pleasure to issue the award to Professor Joshua Epstein. I think and hope all of you present will agree with me that he is a world leader in agent-based modeling. He's developed a number of applications, especially in epidemiology, but not just in epidemiology, and has been very influential methodologically in the community with a number of books that I've pictured here. I'm not even sure that's all of them. I also noted as I was researching a little bit on what Joshua's been working on, that he's one of the few agent-based modelers to get himself a precious Nature paper, and I mean, I think this is something really quite outstanding, and points to his leadership in the field, and a really thorough deserver of this award that our society gives. With Robert Axtell, he was a co-developer of Sugarscape, which is now such a canonical model of agent-based modeling that I think anybody trying to put together a new simulation platform for agent-based modeling would be a fool not to include Sugarscape in the library of models to help people understand how to use their system. And for me personally, I found Growing Artificial Societies the book that really helped me get what agent-based modeling was about. It was a real inspiration. It helped me understand and developed one of my first agent-based models. And yeah, I read it avidly from cover to cover. It was well, pivotal. If there was a book that changed my life, it was Growing Artificial Societies. But he's written other books, and of course, generative social science contains the immortal phrase, and I'm going to get the exact wording wrong, but if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. Perfect. And I think this really highlights to some extent what agent-based modeling is all about, and I use it certainly as a way of saying, well, look, it's way harder to fit a curve from the bottom up than it is to adjust the parameters of a high dimensional polynomial until it's bendy enough to fit round the data, but not overfit it. And he's provided the argumentation, I think, that that really enables us to articulate what we do. Agent Zero, I remember him presenting this in I think it was Groningen in 2015. And again, you know, almost modestly, he says, well, look, you know, we need a way of deciding how to simulate decision making. We need to have some cognitive foundations. We need an alternative to utility maximization. Here's a candidate. Knock it down if you like, but at least I've put something up in its place. So I hope this really highlights just how inspiring he's been. And we have this system for nominating awardees, where members of the society can write in and nominate who they think should receive the award. And I don't know if Gretchen Hofstede is here, but I think he should be credited anyway with the nomination. I wouldn't want him. I hope he's not embarrassed. But I know he said of generative social science that this book blew his mind. And again, I'm seeing comments in the chat that support this. So yeah, it's my great honor then to hand the award, the Rosario Conti Award for Outstanding Contribution to Social Simulation to Joshua. And to that end, I've obviously had to record a video of me doing it before posting it to him. So here we go.
It is to my great regret that I'm unable to do this in person, but here is Joshua Epstein's certificate for the Rosario Conti Award for Outstanding Contribution to Social Simulation 2020. And I'm going to hand it over to him virtually now.
And it came all the way over the internet, and here it is.
There we go.
I have my copy. Can I see that? I don't know. Here.
Well, you need to get rid of your background.
Oh, crud.
We just got a glimpse of it.
It winged across the world, and I have it in my hand right here, proudly.
That's super. So Joshua has very kindly agreed to give us a talk, and I've been really looking forward to this all week. It's almost cruel of Flaminio to put it right at the end. But Joshua, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored, and I also appreciate all the chat remarks. Let's share my screen if we can do that. Let's see. Does that work? Can anyone see that?
Yep, you're up.
All right, beautiful. Whoops. Let's see. What happened? I'd like to go to the beginning. Okay, so first of all, it's an immense honor to accept this award. And I'm just humbled. I really appreciate how many colleagues, how many collaborators really share in it. So thank you very, very much. I'm also honored, of course, to follow in the footsteps of the previous winners, my dear friends, Uri Walensky and Nigel Gilbert, who have made such fundamental contributions to the field. I thank Flaminio, of course, for organizing this spectacular event, and Gary and the other members of the selection committee, all from the bottom of my heart. I couldn't be more honored, so thank you so much. I thought I'd give a talk called Agent-Based Modeling Forward and Backward. And the title is kind of a double entendre. While I certainly want to look backward a little bit, though mostly forward at some cutting edge topics, I also want to distinguish between the forward problem in agent-based modeling and the backward problem, which I call inverse generative social science. I chaired a panel yesterday with Yvonne Garibay and Robin Pershaus on this topic, and I think it's a very big move, theoretically and practically, for the future of our field. So I want to look forward, mostly, pursuant to Einstein's quote, "Life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving." Words to live by. And, you know, recognizing that there's nothing new under the sun. If from my bicycle, I were forced to suggest some contributions that I may have made, I'd like to think, very much as Gary already said, that, you know, I like to think I've articulated a reasonably clear generative explanatory standard for the social sciences to get the epistemology right. With others, I've developed and refined, I think, what is now a mature scientific instrument for generative social science, the agent-based computational model. And also with others, many in the room, I'm applying that instrument to diverse fields from epidemiology to economics, along with many of you, which is great. And I had the rare opportunity of 5 years of sort of uninterrupted funding to develop a formal alternative to the anomaly-ridden rational actor with whom to populate these models. And that's Agent Zero, who we'll talk about. So, you know, I'd like to think maybe I contributed in those ways. But of course, that's not how it all unfolded at all. So it sounds very tidy. You know, first develop the explanatory standard, then develop the tool, and then apply it to explain things. Lovely. That's not at all how it happened. The actual story of Sugarscape is recounted in the keynote I gave at Rob and my 20th Sugarscape anniversary party. Flaminio was there, many of you probably were. And the talk was called Agent-Based Modeling from Napkins to Nations. And if you'd like to see the talk, it's on YouTube. But, you know, way before there was a mature epistemology of generative explanation, and long before there was any mature scientific instrument, Rob and I invented this model really on napkins in the Brookings cafeteria, really out of thin air as an exploratory exercise. It was really the simplest possible hunter-gatherer world we could dream up as part of the 2050 sustainability project that Brookings did with the Santa Fe Institute and the World Resources Institute. And Rob was able to excavate an early napkin era sketch of the model, and it's on the left here. And you can see that it's very embryonic. The terminology hadn't stabilized at all. We were talking about citizens and predators. Lots and lots on the cutting room floor from there to the sort of first movie of the Sugarscape book. One of the things that did survive, of course, was gradient of the concentration. Follow the sugar gradient, which is, you know, we're following a sugar gradient. What can I say? Just for old time's sake, here's the initial run. A lot of agents die. Many of them migrate to these peaks. Other ones are perfectly happy living out here in the hinterlands. Around that time, I actually wrote From Napkins to Nap. Nap is Ed Knapp, the Santa Fe Institute president at the time. And I wrote this memo proposing that we really, you know, drive this field ahead. And I asked at that point, is there a small set of local rules governing the behavior of individual agents that over many iterations will generate a crude caricature of, say, the observed international system? A coherent set of societies with internal structures and dynamics interacting with one another in various cooperative and competitive ways in an environment that is affected by and feeds back on the productive activities of the agents. You know, Tom Schelling was one of my dearest friends, but conspicuously absent from the NAP memo is Tom's wonderful, prescient, brilliant, seminal segregation model. And it's absent for the simple reason that Rob and I literally had never heard of it when we built the Sugarscape model. I guess that's a testament to our illiteracy, but but just as an historical point, that's just the way it was. Rob was also able to excavate the first version of the code, which is version 0.0. And again, it has this goofy terminology, citizens, predators. We hadn't thought of the name Sugarscape yet. It was written in Think Pascal. Gary will remember that, before there was even object-oriented programming. So it was quite a wilderness by comparison to where we are today. And again, the idea was, how simple can we keep things and still get some core behavior? Groups, competition within groups, competition between groups, and interaction with an environment, all pursuant to Einstein's other great quote, as simple as possible, but no simpler. So, you know, apropos of that, we began to add dimensions to the model: sexual reproduction, tribe formation, combat, inheritance, trade. We even had a unified immunology, epidemiology, which is still among the only ones that I've seen. And all of this could be going on at once as a unified social science. So at some point, we were working on all of this, and we figured, hey, you know, the agents are accumulating sugar. So there's a sugar wealth distribution in this world that's evolving. And we knew that modern wealth distributions are highly skewed, but we had no suspicion that the sugar distribution would look like anything real. But we figured, let's take a look and just animate the histogram. And here's what happened. Start with random endowments. They're just running around following the sugar gradient and so forth. And lo and behold, the x-axis is rescaling because people are getting richer. The frequency in those bins is on the y-axis. The darn thing formed up into a skewed distribution that was a Pareto law. And we thought, you know, wow, we didn't expect that. And at a Brookings trustee meeting with Pamela Harriman and Robert S. McNamara, John Steinbrunner, who's really one of the unsung heroes of this whole movement, he pointed to that distribution and said, that's important. And I think it was really the first time Rob and I imagined that the agent-based model could be a serious empirical scientific instrument where you grow or generate macro structures from the bottom up and compare them to actual data, which really led to the conjecture that perhaps one day people will interpret the question, can you explain it, as asking, can you grow it? So I really felt at the time the notion of an explanation were really the stakes here. And the book ends by saying, in effect, we're proposing a generative program for the social sciences and see the artificial society as its principal scientific instrument. You know, it's come a long way since then. The generative standard has been elaborated, I think, much more carefully and fully, and I'll discuss that a little later. Obviously, since then, you know, from hunter-gatherers in Pascal, the mature programming tools have emerged, object-oriented programming, and then agent environments like NetLogo, Repass, Mason. It's just absolutely spectacular difference. And those have led to lots and lots of applications across the social, economic, behavioral health, and the transformation of several fields. I would count infectious disease modeling among those, but I think economics is also being fundamentally reshaped by this perspective. And this workshop, again, thanks to Flaminio, is dazzling evidence of how far things have come, way beyond what we could have seen from the Brookings cafeteria. And we all can be very proud of that. Our community should be very proud of that. To have a flagship journal, to have our society, and everything that's going on. I mean, I am so honored by the award, but all of that is the real honor. And I thank you all for, let's just keep it going. Anyway, as a result of those advances in technology and thinking, we have now built some very large scale calibrated models. And I thought I'd just show you a couple of them, including the one that's the Nature paper is about. One of them is, you know, an urban scale artificial Los Angeles with all traffic color coded for velocity. And we can release airborne toxic contaminants into this world, and then see what's the best way to, what makes a city resilient to an environmental shock like this. You could shelter in place, you could evacuate, you can change the permeability of buildings. If you evacuate, you can do optimal routing, carpooling. There are a million ways to cope with this, but this is a tool that lets you build what I call petabyte playbooks for urban resilience to shocks like this. It's been published. Should have given the footnote. The national model, this is an infectious disease model that we did for NIH. It's an H1N1 swine flu model, published, John Parker was the real software engineer here, and it's published in the Annals of Computing Machinery Transactions on Modeling and Computer Simulation. But one run, of course, all runs, we all know in our community, are just sample paths of a stochastic process, right? You never publish these eye candy runs, right? You turn all of that off, build up a serious portrait, compare it to something. But that said, here's an eye candy run of a swine flu pandemic beginning in Los Angeles. One pattern that runs through my work is everything bad starts in Los Angeles, because I was born in New York. So, but black is healthy, red is sick, blue is recovered. So purple ones, half the people are sick and half are recovered. And here's a base case where there's no interventions, no vaccine, no mask wearing, no distancing. You just let it run wild. And how does it go? And you can use that to ask what happens if you do distancing, mask wearing, vaccines, etc. The large scale model, by the way, that's 300 million agents, this model. And the global model is 6.5 million agents. And again, we built this for NIH. And, you know, if you let a novel pathogen, we were told what the novel pathogen should be. It was a combination, a crossover of the bird flu and the swine flu. Bird flu and normal flu, sorry. So that it's as contagious as normal flu, but as deadly as bird flu. But again, the main point is not the bug. The main point is, here's this technology that lets you track how things spread all around the globe. And of course, apropos of COVID, once it's in China, you know, things really take off. Okay, so those are great, you know, engineering achievements, I think, but it all started with a completely idealized toy exploratory model. And really, that's my favorite kind of modeling. And my favorite quote about modeling is actually this: "Art is a lie that helps us see the truth." Picasso said that. What does he mean by that? And what in the heck does it have to do with modeling? What's this? If we were all in a classroom, people would say, well, you know, it's a painting of a busy street, a busy market, or a street fair of some kind. It was painted by Camille Pissarro and is named Fair in Dieppe, a town in France. It's perfectly clear what's going on at the social level, right? You look at this, say, what's going on? Well, there's a swirl of activity in an open air market, right? Socially, it's clear what's happening. Are the individuals clear? Are they precise? Here are a few of them. No, they're crude gobs of paint. And if you look up at them closely, here they are. They don't look a bit like humans. The painting is the cover of my book, Generative Social Science, that Gary kindly mentioned, which has many examples where crude microagents can generate clear macro patterns, just as Picasso would have it. Art, the agents, are lies, completely distorted blobs that help us see the social truth. And Pissarro said, you know, paint the character of the thing. This is great advice to modelers. Don't try to capture the details. Get at the essence of the thing. Paint the character of the thing. So this remains my favorite kind of model. Dream up agents that are incredibly simple, but that generate interesting and important social dynamics. Try to reveal the core drivers as simply as possible, but no simpler, as Einstein admonished. So it's an art. My most recent gob of paint is this, agent 0. And speaking of paint, I would have used Rothko for the cover, but his estate forbade even Princeton from using any of his artwork. Here again, this is really pursuant to the mature idea that to explain a social regularity, show how it could emerge to, on timescales of interest in a population of cognitively plausible agents. Does the micro specification generate the macroscopic explanandum? If so, M is a generative explanatory candidate. So yeah, the motto is, if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. And in predicate calculus, for any X, if you didn't grow X, then you didn't explain X. But it's a negative criterion. I'm not saying the converse. Any old way of growing is explanatory. And very importantly, I'm not saying these things are unique. And we're going to talk about inverse generative social science as a way of producing more candidates. So it's a sufficient, generative sufficiency is necessary. And of course, as we all know, it's very different than game theory or optimal control or regression analysis, all right? But the key point is cognitively plausible agents. What do you mean by that? And I thought, look, again, really simply, very provisionally, very crudely, as Gary says, yeah, let's put something up there and change it, reject it, improve it, vary it, what have you. But I thought to get the synthesis going, and I say, I don't, you know, I'm not interested in getting the modules finished. I'm interested in getting the synthesis started. We've proved the modules, but what's the right conceptual picture? And I thought, look, a cognitively plausible agent has emotions. And I'm going to play a lot with fear since we understand that a little bit. They also have deliberative capacity, but it's not perfectly rational. It's bounded. This is all in the tradition of Herb Simon and Dan Kahneman and many others. And they're connected to one another. The emotionally driven, boundedly rational agents influence one another. And all of those might matter. So, okay, I figured out a way to endow this software agent with distinct, effective, deliberative, and social modules, each grounded in contemporary neuroscience. The internal modules interact to produce observable individual behavior. And when you put a bunch of them together, they generate a wide variety of collective dynamics, disturbing collective dynamics, in fields of conflict, economics, law, and so forth. And again, as I say, the modules can be refined, but get the synthesis started. That was the idea, and it's all provisional as far as I'm concerned. But it's formal, and this is crucial. Lots of empirical criticisms of the rational actor, but you know, and critical experiments showing that humans depart from the canons of rationality and so forth. But you know, gripes and anomalies, even decisive experiments, don't change practice. You have to have formal alternatives. Samuelson, I think, said, you can only beat a model with another model. So you have to have a formal alternative, and agent 0, you know, is one, mathematical and computational. Again, I'm going to talk a lot about this idea of inverse generative social science, that maybe we can come up with lots of other ones. But again, the idea is just simple picture. Hume said, reason is a slave to the passions. And Aristotle, man is by nature a social animal. So I was looking for just the simplest convolution of those dimensions: passion, reason, and sociality. All right? And so I want to show you a couple of these very simple, simple runs, because I thought it might be interesting, and it sets the stage for some other topics. But anyway, let's pick a violence interpretation. So agents occupy some landscape, and this model again is, you know, 3 agent zeros. We've scaled everything up dramatically, and I'll come back to that. But I wanted the simplest model that could exhibit majorities. So 3. Agents occupy a landscape of sites. These are yellow sites. These are not agent 0 type sites. They just are things that can blow up or not. Some sites are inactive, and some, excuse me, orange sites are active and fear-inducing. Think of them as ambushes, that's all. There's an action the agents can take. destroy some yellow sites. When they do, I paint them blood red. And the stimulus landscape and other agents produce a disposition to take that action. So there's an affective module where agents are fear conditioning on these aversive stimuli. They're not deciding, they're not choosing, they're conditioning, and I'll come back to that. That's the passion, affective component. Meanwhile, they are taking data on their neighborhood. They only have von Neumann neighborhood vision, north, south, east, west, one site. Obviously, you can change that. And they're making a simple calculation of the relative frequency of bad sites to total sites within their vision. That's their reason module. And they add those to form their solo disposition, their propensity to perform the destructive act on their own, when they're just alone. So if they're not in contact with any others, then the solo disposition is all that's included. But they're social animals, and they add others, solo dispositions. And in the model, the weights are actually endogenous. I tried to get at the question of why do networks even happen? And so there's you can pick a network, but you can also grow one. But if the total disposition exceeds the threshold, then they take the action. Destroy the sites, flee the scene, refuse vaccine, dump assets, binge on Oreos, whatever it happens to be, join the choir, whatever it is. And I call these runs computational parables, and one of the central ones is the slaughter of innocence parable. So one agent is fixed in the peaceful south. Other agents are moving around the landscape, and they're subjected to these ambushes. They're becoming fearful of yellow sites through associative conditioning. They're also making a calculation of how likely is it that I'm going to get blown up. And if and they're weighing the dispositions of others. And if all of that exceeds their threshold, they blow up sites. And what's interesting is, even though he's subjected to no stimulus at all, this agent also blows up his site. So let's take a look at this movie. Very simple. He blows up his site with no stimulus at all. I think that's interesting and disturbing. He joins the lynch mob, even though he's had no bad experiences with any Black people. Now, why does that happen? To understand really why it happens, just the quickest look at the overall setup. I'm not going to subject you to the technical details, but again, what's the picture? The picture is there's some binary action the agent can take, destroy sites. It's just do it or don't, binary action. And there's some threshold. If his disposition exceeds a threshold, he does it. His disposition to act is the sum of an affective function and a deliberative function, both of which are just bounded functions defined on this random stimulus space. And the disposition, for the moment, is just the sum. Agents also carry weights, unconsciously, largely, I think. So I define total disposition as the solo disposition plus the sum of the weighted solo dispositions of others, and you can relax all of these things. And the rule is simply, if the total exceeds the threshold, go. Or if you subtract the threshold from the total, then it's just, if net disposition's positive, go. So simple rule. It's not imitation of anybody, actually, because nobody's actions are actually visible. Rather, it's a process of dispositional contagion, and I thought that's an important point, important distinction, because, you know, imitation doesn't explain the first actor. The first actor has no one to imitate. So how do you get things going? And I thought just random, you know, noise is just cheating. You have to have some better mechanism than that. And under the hood, there's more of this. But it's very parsimonious, okay, which is important to me. There are only 3 rules: update your affect, update your probability, update your disposition, act if that exceeds the threshold. And there are only 3 parameters in the model. There's the fear learning rate. There's a memory window, how far back you calculate the relative frequency, and the threshold, which is equal across all agents. And the weights in the full up model are endogenous. That eliminates 2n parameters. So I think it's quite simple. I mean, I think people attack agent-based modeling and say, well, it's kitchen sink, there's all this stuff in it. There's really not much in there. And I tried to rake as much out as I could. I mean, it's, you know, I think people outside our world always think, well, you know, the model's done when you can't add anymore. But of course, what we believe is that the model's done when you can't take anything else out. So we're trying to pare it down as much as possible and get the synthesis started with plausible modules. All right. The subtitle is, excuse me, Neurocognitive Foundations. And we talked about generative social science. But what's this neurocognitive business? Again, I was mostly interested in fear acquisition, and fear extinction. So now I'll butcher some neuroscience. A lot of the action is in the amygdaloid complex, where you get some input like a threatening sound or a threatening animal. And this, excuse me, this produces excitation of various areas of the brain, which then put out hormones and all sorts of other signals that produce freezing. I throw a snake in your lap, you freeze. You don't think about the snake, you just freeze. Here's a picture of this. But this is the point, right? There's the fear circuitry is what Joe Ledoux, my colleague at NYU, calls the low road. It's quick and dirty. I throw the snake in your lap, you freeze. You don't deliberate about, is this really a cobra or a toy snake or a garden snake? You just freeze. Later, you think about it and say, oh, Josh was just goofing around. He threw a toy snake in my lap. But initially, you just freeze. And this is the process we're interested in. You can create associative fears by conditioning. And this is one of a zillion examples where the idea is here's an fMRI of an individual. And this is his amygdala, the fear center, if you. And orange means that blood is being recruited to the amygdala, which is evidence of excitation and so forth. There's all other ways to measure this. But the idea is, if I just show you a blue light, nothing happens. You couldn't care less about the blue light. If I shock you with a shock cuff, then you freeze. Your amygdala is recruited. Now, if I start pairing blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock, I do that enough, then I show you the blue light alone. You're thinking the shock is coming, so you activate even in the absence of a shock. This is called associative learning, and there's a simple model of it published by Rescorla and Wagner that says the associative gain is a fear learning rate and times the maximum minus your old fear, all right? And lambda is typically taken to be 1. But the learning rate is the product of surprise and salient. So this should be alpha and beta. It requires both to really learn. And learning is fastest when the stimulus is shocking here. And we become inured and learning slows down as it flattens out. All right? And, you know, in the setting of a financial crisis or something like that, surprise depends on your expectations, right? I mean, if you have no expectations, there's no notion of surprise. But in a speculative bubble, expectations are artificially high. So any sudden collapse, even a modest one bank, can be especially surprising and salient, and everybody gets very frightened quickly. And they can spread the fear to others. I mean, that's a hypothesis. Does it make any sense to say it's contagious? Well, here's our earlier experiment. And here's a much more interesting experiment by Olson and Phelps. Phelps is also at NYU, where they said, okay, this is the familiar picture, but the real experiment concerns an observer of this conditioning trial. So the top panel is our subject alone, blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light, and his amygdala is recruited. This is the signature of an observer of the first person's conditioning trials. He's not wearing a shock cuff, he's not subjected to any shocks, and he sees the other guy, blue light shock, blue light shock. Then I show him the blue light and his amygdala lights up. So it's certainly true that you can acquire fears without experiencing the stimulus yourself. And of course, that's great because it means I can fear the stove by seeing you get burned. I don't have to burn myself on the stove. But it's double-edged, right? It's also a machinery that produces non-conscious acquisition and transmission of all sorts of baseless fears and biases, right? Fear can fade if the stimulus stops, and that also is part of the full Rescorla-Wagner picture. If I am acquiring fear and then all the stimulus stops, the fear will ultimately fade away, not instantly. And this is what we see in lots of animal models. It's actually what Joe Ledoux calls these survival circuits that are preserved across vertebrate evolution. So this is a very general phenomenon. The full equation, if you like it, is here. And what I like to say is we don't fear what the rat fears. We fear how the rat fears. Fear extinction is sometimes your enemy, right? You can produce cycles of vigilance and complacency, which are very important. And in producing second waves of pandemics, since we're worrying about COVID, this is one very important mechanism. So imagine a model in which the initial disease spike produces fear. That produces distancing. People go to their basement. That suppresses the epidemic. That produces fear extinction. And that produces relaxation of distancing. People come out of their basement, but they're pouring susceptible individuals back onto the infected embers, and it produces disease resurgence, multiple waves. We have a paper called Coupled Contagion Dynamics of Fear and Disease that explores this, but it's exactly what happened in 1918. Big spike, big social distancing. Then they thought, well, you know, there's not much bug around. Let's let everybody out. And it blew up again because it's sufficient to have very few infectives to have the thing take off. So this is what happened in the UK and Wales. This is what happened in US cities in 1918, 19, and this is what's happening now. This is last week, Madrid. And all over states of the United States, we're seeing the same thing. So, you know, these fear complacency cycles are a huge deal. But there's more going on. As I said, reason may be a slave to the passions, but once in a while it does happen, however badly. But typically we have incomplete and imperfect information and makes erroneous appraisals of it. There's a whole rack of robustly documented errors, framing effects, endowment effects, representatives, base rate neglect, anchoring. Agent Zero, as a local relative frequentist, exhibits several of those. I mean, representative heuristic and base rate neglect. But agents driven by strong emotions and doing bad statistics on bad data also influence one another. So the third ingredient is contagion, but conformist pressures can produce widespread convergence on counterproductive behavior. And conformity effects are documented in many spheres. Again, is there a neural basis for this when we're thinking neurocognition, neurocognitive foundations for generative social science? Yeah, there's very interesting results that Ethan Cross and others have done. And they write, when rejection is powerfully elicited, areas of the sensory, areas that support the sensory components of pain become active. And he says, these results give new meaning to the idea that rejection hurts. Rejection and pain are similar, not only in that they're distressing, they share a common somatosensory representation. And again, he did this wonderful fMRI work where people are shown images of a wife who abandoned them, a team that ostracized them, kids that refused to play football with you, all these experiments. And he's finding these, that you get high positive predictive value for this excitation of these pain regions. Okay, so the third ingredient was network weights. Okay, so the logic of the model is, you know, there's a stimulus landscape that and other agents that produce disposition. It's compared to a threshold and you act. And the action alters the stimulus pattern. You blow up sites, so you change the landscape. So sure, there's interplay between agents and their environment, between micro and macro. The environment affects the agents, which affects the environment. And I think quite a lot of ink has been spilled on this rather simple idea, a lot of fancy terminology, when you're really saying, yep, agents affect the macro world and it feeds back to affect the agents. And, you know, I think it's actually quite a straightforward thought. So we had this parable where the agent acts first. I mean, the agent follows with no stimulus. And now we understand why. That's why I went through a little of this, is that his solo disposition is less than his threshold. but his total disposition with everybody else exceeds his threshold. So he does something in the group he would not do alone. Now, he might be the only agent with that ordering, in which case, despite being negatively disposed, he goes first. This is my favorite run, I think, where he's got no stimulus at all, and he's the first. He leads the lynch mob. And he's not imitating any behavior. That strikes me as a very disturbing and interesting finding. Goes first without stimulus. So is he a leader? Everybody would think, well, he's a man of conviction and he goes first. Or is he just the most susceptible to dispositional contagion? And Tolstoy's answer is the latter. He wrote, "A king is history's slave, performing for the swarm life." Wonderful phrase. Even more troubling is the case where everybody betrays themselves in this sense. And here I invented this jury trial where there's a pre-trial stimulus pattern. Everybody's out there in the street hearing about, O.J. Simpson's guilt. Nobody's in contact, all weights are off. Then they're chosen to be jurors in a trial where they get a different stimulus pattern, the prosecution and the defense. Now it's barristers barking at them, but the weights are still off. And then they go into the jury chamber where weights are on and they can affect one another. So I call it 12 Angry Agent Zeros after the great movie, 12 Angry Men. And they convict in the group unanimously when they would acquit alone. So again, out in the street, you get a stimulus pattern here, all weights are off. Then in the courtroom, you get a different stimulus pattern, all weights are off. Then you get no stimulus, weights are on, and they all convict. And I'm not going to show you the movie. But the idea is, in the first two phases, there's no communication and no weight until the jury chamber. Then they all switch from acquit, their sub-threshold, before the jury chamber. But in the jury chamber, they unanimously convict. So again, in our algebra, that means for every I, every agent, their threshold exceeds their solo. They'd acquit in isolation, but in the group, they convict unanimously. So no jurors would have convicted before the trial, but they're unanimous, having interacted directly. And I think all of this adds up to a pretty unsettling picture of people, of us, of the human condition. And I'll read this, although it's rude to read your own stuff, but this is maybe worth reading. The overall picture of Homo sapiens reflected in these interpretations of Agent Zero is unsettling. Here we have a creature evolved, that is selected, for high susceptibility to unconscious fear condition. Fear, conscious or otherwise, can be acquired rapidly through direct exposure or indirectly through fearful others. This primal emotion is moderated by a more recently evolved deliberative module, data, and whose risk appraisals are normally biased further by affect itself. Both affective and cognitive modules, moreover, are powerfully influenced by the dispositions of similar, equally limited and unconsciously driven agents. Is it any wonder that collectivities of interacting agents of this type, the Agent Zero type, can exhibit mass violence, dysfunctional health behaviors, and financial panic? So, the agent who would never act alone, but who leads the lynch mob, and the jury, each of whom would acquit alone, but who unanimously convict. I think these are the most provocative runs. And since the book, I've been working hard on several questions. One is, how robust are those results? Are they just one-off things that don't really happen much? How does the whole business scale? And can we prove anything mathematically about this phenomenon? So I've upgraded the code, and you can do endogenous networks as before. You can also stipulate fixed networks. It's not just 3 agents, it's arbitrary agents. And you can pick the network and stipulate a degree distribution. This is exponential with mean 5. And the first actor phenomenon certainly does occur. Here's an example with more agents where the north, all the stimulus is in the north, all the activation is in the south. And I've spent some time on visualization. My my predecessor, whose shoulders the giant whose shoulders I'm standing on, and Nigel's, Uri Walensky, I've actually spent some of my grant funding on NetLogo, and at my instigation, he and Aaron Brandis developed NetLogo 2.5D that was really, the latest version was released last Monday. And it's a very nice way to visualize these first actor self-betrayal phenomena. The Z value is disposition. And what you see is all the activations in the south, all the stimulus is in the north. These are the links. And you see that what can happen is these guys never activate, but they do activate these guys despite their having no stimulus. A movie of that is this. Here's the activation pattern. Dispositions are growing, and they wipe out their sites. Another example with the links erased, maybe that's a little clearer, is this one. And I recommend this tool to you. I think it's a wonderful extension of NetLogo. But, you know, again, we have a lot of examples of this, and we actually, my postdoctoral fellow Jiwon Shin and I have worked up some mathematics. She's been a great postdoc. And we have analytical conditions, depending on the degree distribution, in degrees, out degrees, and weights, for the northerners, for the southerners to go first. Solar dispositions of northerners are all the same. And here's a condition that we've actually derived mathematically for the first actor in the south. With no southern networks, if you add southern networks, you get a different condition. But these are analytical expressions for the general phenomenon. So, you know, I think it's important. I think we should try harder to prove things, by the way. I mean, I think it's a lot of elbow grease, but to the extent we can actually produce some analytics, that's good. I mean, obviously, it's also great to run the thing a million times and build up a statistical portrait, which is also fabulous. So that's some Agent Zero stuff. Another spin, another move from Agent Zero is to build Addict Zero, which I've been at work on with several different teams. And the idea there is swap out the fear module and swap in a model for the neurobiology of addiction. Build the toy first, of course, then flesh it out for tobacco, alcohol, opioids. And I'm working with different groups on each of those. But again, the idea here is the affective non-deliberative module is the addiction level, which is some increasing function of the sustained dosage. And early work on smoking found that the curve was logarithmic. But in any event, you don't decide to be thirsty or to crave heroin or to experience withdrawal. They're not choices. They're just neurobiological states. So that's the affective module. The deliberative module would take in observations, policy messages, other data informing a conscious appraisal about the costs of continued use, and you interact with others who might be promoting or suppressing your behavior. Agents could switch between users and non-users. Maybe promoters who quit might become suppressors, for example. And then the analogy would be your disposition to try quitting depends on, as before, this general formalism. And as a very toy first cut with no basis at all, in fact, you might try. The probability of quitting, if you try, is proportional to 1 minus your addiction level. If you're severely addicted, it's hard, right? And again, as to the acquisition curves, early on, informations, messages, prices, opportunity costs might matter. But over time, the affective module, the addictive module, can just eclipse everything else. I mean, in economic terms, the price elasticity of demand for heroin just goes to zero. Agent Zero economics is another move that I'm involved with. We have a nice new agreement with the OECD, New Approaches to Economic Challenges, which also involve the École Polytechnique and Oxford INET that Doan Farmer and others are part of. And there's a very nice paper by Americ V on using Agent Zero to study information selection in markets. Beyond Agent Zero, I'm very excited about this. inverse generative social science. Several of us, Rob, Yvonne Garibay, Matt Kohler, Bill Rand, held a founding workshop on this in January, just before COVID, at MITRE. And several of us, Yvonne, Bill, and Robin, and me, held a panel yesterday on this. And I recommend the recorded proceedings, which include several very concrete examples of this. Because my talk is actually recorded, I'm not going to repeat much of it here. But subject to all the refinements we discussed and so forth, the basic idea, again, is if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. But there might be many ways to grow it. And inverse generative social science enlists artificial intelligence, machine learning, evolutionary programming to discover those alternatives. And it's not how these techniques of AI have really been used. Typically, you hear about artificial intelligence displacing humans in work, or augmenting humans, or defeating humans in various endeavors, but not explaining humans. AI is defeating us, augmenting us, displacing us, but not explaining us. And we want to enlist it in that enterprise, in the generative explanatory enterprise. So for example, AlphaZero just crushes humans at chess. It also crushes all other computers at chess and does quite eerie things for those of you who are interested. But it doesn't illuminate how humans play chess. And my favorite example is, Garry Kasparov beat IBM's chess computer, Deep Blue, with a brilliant, startling queen sacrifice. And after the game, he was asked, how in the world did you come up with that? And he said, it smelled right. And I think we humans do lots of things by smell, without the explicit calculation of costs and benefits, which is assumed in the dominant theory of rational choice. And there is a next generation of agents that include emotions and social influence and errors and so forth. And I think they do promise to give us deeper explanations of collective dynamics. But they, I think including Agent Zero, are particular handcrafted solutions of the forward problem. I mean, Agent Zero is a handcrafted solution of the forward problem. Design the agents, grow a target. But we want to use AI to evolve larger families of generators, beginning not with the agents, but with the targets. The cognitively plausible agents, or families of them, or neighborhoods of them, then become outputs of AI-enabled inverse generative social science. And I think that'll really stand the field on its head. We'd go from forward modeling, where you specify the agents and generate the target, to the backward problem of specify the target and generate the agents. Hence my double entendre title of the talk. And it would position us, I think, to address several challenges. I mean, I'm often, I present something, or the Anasazi, and people say, okay, you found one generator, but aren't there others? If this would permit us to generate families of agent models, then we could say, yeah, all the following architectures generate the target. Take your pick or give us one of your own. It would also address this, I think, quite illegitimate claim that agent-based models are ad hoc. I mean, I think the classical agents are not entirely ad hoc, certainly no more than the rational actor, especially now that economists can choose from a huge menagerie of utility functions. I mean, we have a unified theory of maximum utility. Well, that's not very unified if you can choose from an infinitude of U's. So this is kind of people in glass houses. Nonetheless, I mean, I think it's important to consider that, look, to some extent, yes, it's ad hoc, and we should try to increase the family of generators. This is not the end of theory, as some people may lament. We're still going to build handcrafted agents, but this additional approach would change the locus of theory from the completed agent to constituents, rules, modules, building blocks. The building blocks still have to be germane to the problem. I mean, you don't want to say, pick a preferable shelling site and also eat a cookie. That'll generate the same segregation pattern, but includes something obviously extraneous. So, and you'll also want to meet defensible notions of cognitive plausibility. I offer Agent Zero as one of these, but we should evolve many other variants. In the book, I actually say, look, the relative frequentist So put in a Bayesian instead. Put in a neural network module. Instead of Rescorla-Wagner, do temporal difference learning or some other algorithm. We need to play with these modules. And if we let those be the building blocks, the Lincoln logs, and then feed evolutionary program the concatenation operators and define some fitness metric, we can just design agents with different architectures. And all of that will require art and judgment, but at a different level of the primitives and concatenation operators. It also will, there'll be trade-offs between deep, highly accurate trees, agents, that offer no theoretical insight, and less accurate but more understandable solutions. And an example of this complexity accuracy trade-off is from a project I have with Robin Pershaus and Tuong Vu and others on inverse generative social science and drinking behavior. So this is from our paper in Gecko. But you know, the terminals, the modules are the injunctive norm, which is what you perceive to be the social norm regarding drinking, the descriptive norm, which is your statistical appraisal of the drinking prevalence, and the utility you derive from drinking alcohol, and your autonomy, how much do you care about social norms. So there are these simple 4 little components: injunctive norm, descriptive norm, payoff, and autonomy, that can be combined in myriad ways. And the functions we're permitting in this evolutionary program are add quantity, subtract them, multiply them, take their square root, do the complement, and so forth. And when you score them on a fitness metric like this against the data on drinking, then you get many different solutions. These are all John Koza-like expressions, Koza being the father of genetic programming. But you get some solutions like this very good estimate. You get a very high, very low estimation error, but the model's very complicated. It's very hard to understand what's happening here. And you get other ones that are much more comprehensible, but don't do as well. So there's this trade-off surface, and but it does produce a highly fit, rule, highly fit agent. And there are many other examples. Ivan and Chataka's inverse Anasazi model, this evolves rules that outperform our original Anasazi paper, so I think that's wonderful. Chataka also has this great inverse Schelling model that evolves many new fascinating rules that also generate segregation. And I'd love to see evolved variations on agent 0 that generate the same disturbing phenomenon, or others in economics and health behavior. So grow agent 0 and grow lots of other things too. So back to the future, again, sort of trying to wrap up a little here. Inverse generative social science may address some, idée fixe of mine it was interesting to read this Knapp memo from '92. And I asked, what systems of local rules will generate politically egalitarian or totalitarian societies? What rule systems will yield peaceful or cooperative aggregates versus warlike and competitive ones? Can revolutions be made to emerge? What ideological patches may come out? Inverse generate the 10 commandments. I think that's a great idea. Let's grow the 10 commandments. And are there cyclical things and things that are generic, that is structurally stable in the mathematical sense? And overall though, I think we've made tremendous progress. The development of agent modeling and in our scientific community has been just utterly spectacular. I never dreamed of all of this. And as the great workshop, thanks to Flaminio, shows, there's just a huge amount going on, forward, backward, and every which way. So I'm profoundly honored by my wonderful award again. Thanks again to Gary and the committee. And in conclusion, harking back to Einstein on his bicycle, I will simply say, let's stay on our bikes and keep moving. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk, Joshua. It was a real tour de force and a lot to reflect on, I think.
Thank you.
So I'd now like to invite people from the audience, as we've got about 70 people left, just to give us any observations, comments, or questions. I suggest what you do is just flag in the chat you'd like to talk, and or let me know, and then I'll just sort of hand over to you and let you ask. Okay, so just let me know in the chat if you've a question, and then unmute yourself and ask it when invited by me. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I do have one of my own.
Sure.
And well, this is this was my reflection, I think, on your workshop earlier in the week in inverse generative social science. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating, and yeah, I mean, it mind-blowing again. But one of the things that a lot of us find when we're using agent-based models, of course, is we're doing it in stakeholder-led or kind of policy contexts, where we need to be able to explain to the stakeholders, or even maybe just to our interdisciplinary colleagues who don't speak NetLogo, they're not able to write software, so they don't understand what we do. So we need to be able to explain to them what's going on. And I wondered how you would use this inverse generative social science in that context. How would you, when you've chosen a model and you've decided, which one you're going to use to maybe run some scenario or explore something, how would you explain to the stakeholders or to non-expert colleagues in academia exactly what the agents are doing and why? Well,
I mean, that's a great question, and of course I don't know the answer. But one stab at it is, some of the I've had great success in some policy areas on infectious diseases with toy models. I mean, we built after 9/11, there was a huge concern about bioterror, smallpox, and we were enlisted by Health and Human Services to build. There was a big debate about vaccination strategy. I'm getting to the point there. Look, vaccination strategy is a huge, combinatorially massive problem. I mean, there's just a massive number of ways you could distribute a fixed body of vaccine. So I'm going to say, let's inverse generate that. But en route, I mean, this is an example where the good answer is make them build the model with you. Then they know what's going on because they told you what they think. This is most. So we had this experience with smallpox. We were enlisted, and we developed a smallpox working group. And the trick was find a mass vaccination and trace vaccination were that was a huge debate about how to do vaccination. And mass vaccination is bad because the vaccine can kill you if you're immunocompromised. And trace vaccination is bad because you can't trace people if everybody was in O'Hare Airport. So the task was find a novel alternative. And you could try to inverse generate that. But we built a model where there were just the simplest social units, homes, schools, workplaces, and a hospital, because those loomed largest in the data. And we calibrated a model where people move from these, agents move from these things, and the disease progresses. And they provided us a lot of the inputs. You say, someone's got smallpox, how long do they keep marching around? And the doctors on the group said, you're down after 3 days. So we'll put that in, all this stuff. So they helped us build the model. And it's a toy with very understandable rules. Here, I think agents has a huge advantage over equations because you can sit down with policymakers and say, okay, there are 100 families, there's 2 kids, 2 parents. In the morning, they drop their kids at school and go to work, and you see them moving around this landscape. And then the disease is progressing in some idealized form, and they know exactly what's going on, where if you showed them the differential equations version, it's over, right? And then you say, look, we're going to toy around, we're going to grow and evolve different vaccination approaches that vary who gets it and when and who deserves priority and whatnot. And you see that there's this novel approach that is neither mass vaccination nor trace vaccination. And I think if they've got they understand the building blocks of the model, and then you tell them, look, it's just a way of searching these alternatives. It happens to be beautiful in that it's evolutionary, but I don't think it's impossible to explain what's going on. And then when they've got it, you say, okay, now I'm going to show you the national model with 300 million agents. And we're going to say, you know, when do you impose quarantines? When do you lift them? Who gets shots? Who doesn't? So I don't know. It's a long, rambling answer, and I'm not entirely honest because that's not quite how we came up with the vaccination strategy. But in any event, I think that's one of the ways in which you would use it, and I think to great effect in the policy world.
Thank you.
Sure.
Now we've got some questions now coming through on the chat. So Cesar, Garcia Diaz, do you want to ask your question? Just unmute yourself and ask.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Josh.
Hey, Gary.
It is posted on the chat, but I will repeat it.
Oh, good.
In an era of big data, concerns about sophisticated calibration of models and so on, what do you think is the role, or there might be a role for data-free or theoretical models?
Well, that's my favorite kind of modeling, and I think there's always a role for theoretical work. And I'm one of the contributions of theoretical work is it tells you what data to collect. I mean, I think, you know, in the history of science, people sort of imagine, I think social scientists are taught that science goes, you know, first you collect a ton of data, then you try to find some theory that summarizes the data. But that's not at all how it happened in physics, for example. I mean, Maxwell's equations, there was this sprawl of disparate rules, Ohm's law, Faraday's law for electricity, other ones for magnetism. There was no unified picture. And Maxwell, largely out of aesthetic discontent, came up with a unified theory, Maxwell's equations, that unified electricity and magnetism. And that's why it's called electromagnetic theory. But the theory, the pure math, showed that, holy mackerel, there should be electromagnetic waves. No one thought of that. And then, you know, Hertz went out and found them, and they turn out to be radio waves. So the theory preceded the data, and the same is true of special relativity. I mean, Einstein's theory, which is also just pure, I mean, beautiful act of vaulting imagination, says, you know, light should bend in a gravitational wave. So Eddington trops all over the planet to make that measurement. And the Higgs boson, all of these other things, and I'm sure that, you know, many of these models, I mean, Tom's segregation model, he actually invented that flipping coins on an airplane. I never had a chance to talk to Ken Arrow, who I liked very much, about where did he come up with that, the voting paradox. And I bet he came up with it noodling around. I don't know. But he certainly didn't start with data. So I think there are many ways in which science proceeds without data in the first place, and it tells you what data to collect. I think the inverse generative thing depends crucially on data, and we can start with big data and, you know, all sorts of nice data science to compress it and develop important targets, and then use these techniques to find inverse generate agents that produce the observed data. So obviously it works both ways, but I think there's a role for theoretical data-free science, and it's what, you know, what I like to do best anyway. So I'll still be doing it.
Good stuff.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question, that's from Vahid Yasdanpana. If you'd like to unmute and ask, or if you'd rather I just asked your question, I can do that, but I'd like you to ask it, really.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the talk, Josh. Like at the moment, we have lots of critiques against the model that's behind UK's policy, let's say, as from Imperial, and it's a bit simplistic. So do you think like you're lacking good AVMs, like technically not sophisticated AVMs, or it's mainly bad usage of AVMs?
Well, I mean, agent-based modeling is easy to do badly, right? I mean, you can do the tutorials in NetLogo and there you are. building your dot world agent-based model. And I think, you know, it's still a young science, and I don't think, although there's been progress in this also, trying to standardize how this is done a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, there's just a huge spectrum of activities. Vahid, are you at Imperial? Did I hear that?
No, the model that's behind this, like the policy of UK's policy is the Imperial model.
Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, I think Neil Ferguson is one of the very best one or two infectious disease modelers in the world. And I think the model he released early in the COVID epidemic was very carefully circumscribed. I mean, it was written in detail. And it said, look, there's no adaptive human behavior at all. There's no flight, there's no distancing, there's no vaccine, there's no mask, there's no hand washing. Here's exactly what happens in the kind of classical Kermack-McKendrick tradition model. And I think it's completely legitimate to do that. And I don't think Neil said that this is my prediction about it. It said, this is the outcome in the case where there's no adaptation. So if you just sit on your hands, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So I didn't have any problem with that at all. I mean, yeah, right. I mean, I just had no problem with it. But I'm not answering your question. I don't think you were talking about agent-based modeling, and can they be overly complex? Is that the question? Sure.
Yeah, I was wondering, like at the moment in US, is it the point that we don't have sophisticated ABMs, or we have good ABMs, but policymakers are not using it well? Or maybe both? Well,
I mean, this is an unusual circumstance, right? Because who are the policymakers? They're people who don't like science in the first place. And they glommed onto this Washington model that really, you know, I gave a long interview on NPR where I took them to task about their model that was just, you know, a linear extrapolation short-term forecasting model that they just kept splining onto the next data. It's like, today we have a prediction of these many cases, and then next week we have a new prediction of these many cases and a new prediction. To me, that's not a model. It's a seat of the pants linear forecast that you keep doing. So I'm not sure how they chose that modeling group. They improved over time, but it's still not the kind of model where you start the epidemic and the thing generates the full trajectory. I mean, we actually have a model like that. So I don't know. I mean, I think there are agent-based models. I mean, Ira Longini is world-class. You know, Neil is world-class. I think Alex Vespigiani and his group, Barabashi's group, they're world-class. You know, there are a lot of world-class models that really just didn't bubble up to get much attention in this administration. Where in the previous administration, for example, I mean, those models, I mean, there were people from the Midas project that were actually embedded in Homeland, in HHS, trying to understand, will there be a second wave of swine flu? I mean, the previous administration took it very seriously and even went to the lengths of embedding some of these models in the government. And I think CDC also took it quite seriously, and they're under siege as well. So, I mean, I think there's an important role for agent-based modeling in the government and with the government. But I just think the circumstances have been really, you know, just very difficult.
Thanks for the response. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right, we're going to have 3 more questions, and then we'll close the session. So Francisco Navarro, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Jos, for your fantastic presentation. As I understood, the future, as you foresee, will depend more and more on data, right? So I am a little bit concerned about small teams having access to good data, which, you know, is more and more depending on proprietary sources. So what do you think could be the constraints for future or new teams coming to the AVM world and not having very easy access to these huge amounts of data and good data from proprietary sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a serious problem, and we've faced that. I have a project where we're, again, it's a coupled contagion project where we're using big Twitter data to understand attitudes toward vaccine and distancing and so forth. But you know, you can only get a tiny trickle of the real data, and it would be great if we had better access to big data sources of social media and all sorts of other types. You know, I don't know quite what the answer is, except that you know, we need to just keep pressing for these repositories to share their data. I mean, and maybe I mean, again, it's a delicate topic about, you know, whether you force people to share their data or charge people to share their data or all these other things. But I think it's a serious problem that so much of it is locked up. I mean, Blake LeBaron does all this wonderful agent-based financial modeling, and he finds it very hard to get, you know, the people who have the data are the companies, and they're not at all want to share it with others. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I think it's worth a serious sort of summit in its own right. But I take your point, and don't think there's a terribly simple answer right at the moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Josh. In fact, Nigel's just asked a question I think follows on very nicely from the one asked by Vahid. And so if people bear with me, we'll still end with Patricia, but Nigel can jump the queue and ask his question before the next two. So Nigel, would you like to ask yours?
Well, I'm not sure I should be jumping queues.
Oh, of course you should.
Hi, Josh.
Hey, how are you?
Great talk.
Proud to be following in your footsteps and standing on your shoulders and all of that.
Don't be ridiculous. I'm getting a little bit concerned because I think that we should be working harder to educate the public, or citizens, if you like, about the benefits, but also particularly about the pitfalls of agent-based modeling, or indeed about modeling altogether. Yeah. Modeling is now getting to the stage where it's not just something that's done on the back of an envelope or on a napkin in Brookings Institute or in a university. It's going out into the big wide world, and I think it's often the case that its capabilities are either exaggerated or diminished. But the question is, how, if you agree with me about that, how should we set about doing it? How do we educate the public in modeling?
I think that's a great question. I mean, there are a million, I think it has to be done in from a million different directions. I mean, I think we need to do just very, very solid science, where we take, here are observed phenomena that are very important, and other approaches really can't explain them, and we really can. And we have a better mousetrap, and here are some damn mice. That's one side of it. The other side of it is we have these beautiful tools like NetLogo that make it very, very simple to teach. I mean, you know, high school kids, college kids, undergraduates, others. I mean, and maybe the COVID's a disaster, but maybe these online courses. I mean, Erez and I have done one now. Maybe we should be hosting more online courses around the world to get people, get their feet wet, lead them to water, and teach people the rudiments of agent-based modeling from you know, very, very early in their education. So there's like better science, there's better teaching, and I think if we can, you know, influence policy, that's also very high visibility for the community. That has to be done with great care, and we just have to be, you know, brutally honest about what the models include, what they don't include, what their uncertainties are. And just the worst thing we could do is say that we've got crystal balls that you know, that predict the future and are, you know, substitutes for judgment and all of that. You just have to be very careful in how you frame what the models do and don't do, what their uncertainties are, how sensitive they are to different assumptions. And it's still going to be the judgment of policymakers that actually rules the day. So, I mean, I think education, science, policy, but the policy piece has to be handled with very great delicacy. I mean, I wouldn't be bad to have a workshop on that. on how you frame these things, you know, because I think if it's done wrong, you really get damaged.
Yeah, yeah. Not only you, but also the world.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Sure.
Thank you very much, Nigel.
Great question, Nigel. That's central.
So now, Franciszek Calvus. Again, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, but I think you know who I'm referring to. Would you like to ask your question?
No, it was just, it just leads me to maybe violent idea, or because it just brings me idea to Josh's inverse generative social science, that maybe we could describe by our data some ideal society. Then let's the integrative generative social science to derive some agent rules, because it means that by these rules we can reach this societal state. And after I finished this idea, it remembers my childhood in communist Czechoslovakia, and and it remembers me that I was living in such setting, that our leaders that time, they seems to knew what our agent rules should be,
Yeah, right.
to reach ideal kind of society. So maybe it's dangerous idea. So I was just sharing it with all of you, that maybe I'm not the only one who might come with this dangerous idea up.
Yeah. On that grim note, no, but your points will take it. It's very funny, actually. I remember, as a concluded, maybe, I'm happy to stay and talk to anybody as long as you'd like, by the way. But I remember once when our book was translated into Japanese. It was translated into several languages, but one of them was Japanese. And, you know, they flew me over to give this big talk about the book. There were a lot of people there, and they translated it. And the guy introduced me, and he said, the Epstein and Axtell's book shows that society works best when everybody obeys the rules. And obviously that's not all what we had in mind. So, you know, Franciszek, I mean, they can always be manipulated. And it was also translated into Swedish, which I'm sure had a completely different spin on it, right? I'm sure that translation says everything works when people follow their own rules, right? So there's no getting around people interpreting your work, but I certainly hope it isn't being put to the uses you describe.
Thank you. And final formal question goes to Patricia and Tosh. So Patricia, ask away.
Hi, Josh. It's lovely
Hi.
to see you.
Good to see you too. I was wondering if you'd be here.
I am. I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Okay.
So I was wondering, because you have this way with us, with other scientists, to kind of constantly blow our minds again and again. And I think your inverse generative social science is just another thing that you have there for us. And I was wondering, because it doesn't really have to be generative social science. It can actually be any science. It can
Sure.
really, it doesn't even have to be a dynamic mechanism. It just has to be a mechanism. So, you know, we have this outcome, show us, like, please tell us what can lead to that outcome. And, you know, and there's obviously infinity of models that could lead to any outcomes. And I was wondering, kind of, because I don't see it as a threat to scientists. I'm not that dramatic, I think, but I think it is gonna, like all of the other AI, it is gonna change the role of the scientists in the future. And could you please reflect a bit on what is the future role of scientists if we would have these amazing tools to kind of help us in the way that we haven't really used them to help us so far, and in the way that, you know, that we we might not really know the consequences of. You know, they would take away something that's purely scientific. So, and I think it was with the drivers when people were making future predictions. You know, a task of a driver is so complex that no machine could ever replace that. And you know, and to our surprise, or maybe not, it like we are very close to that. So,
yeah.
So who am I gonna be in 20 years, Josh?
I don't know, but it'll be distinctive and brilliant, just as you are now. Yeah, I mean, I think the creative component is going to be, you know, in designing the constituents. It's not going to be build the fully handcrafted agent, although I'll still be doing it. We'll all be doing that. But I think the sort of the locus of creativity and theorizing will be at this lower level, where you're saying, what are the minimum constituents? What are the constituents of rules? And how are they allowed to be combined? And let the evolutionary program combine them and score their fitness and come up with novel solutions that we may not have thought of. You know, a long time ago, there was this great video, Nigel, of the swimmers, Carl Sims, where he just said, here, I'm not going to assemble any fish or lizards or alligators or anything. I'm just going to put these constituents, some sort of proto-fin, some sorts of proto-eyes, some proto-gills, and I'm going to have the hydrodynamics is realistic, but the program is going to assemble these things into viable swimmers. And it came up with all kinds of swimmers that didn't occur in nature. It also came up with shrimp and turtles and all sorts of other fish and so forth. But it came up with novel solutions that no one had thought of. And I don't think it's a threat. It's just a way of stimulating us to think differently about what sort of rules could get us where we want to go. I mean, maybe the goal is, you know, to design a better health system or a better school system or a better vaccination strategy. And, you know, it's just to help humans, not to displace them or defeat them. It's just about augmenting, you know, our repertoire, right? What is the repertoire of agent creation, you know? So I hope I'm right and that they don't take over the world and wipe us all out. But I'm not thinking of it as a threat. I'm really thinking of it as a kind of brave new move where we create the constituents, the Legos, and evolution assembles them in novel, fit ways that inform our thinking and expand our minds and maybe improve our world a little bit.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good note to end on. I always think it's what computers are for are the taking out the boring stuff, yeah, and
Yes.
leaving us free to do the creative and fun stuff. So I think that's a nice thought to end on.
Good question, though, Patricia, really. I hope that answers it.
So then, thank you very much again, Josh, and very, very many congratulations to you for being our third awardee. I'd now like to hand over to Flaminio just to close off this first social simulation week, which I think has gone very well indeed. So yeah, thank you, and a round of applause from me.
Thank you, all of you.
So thank you, Josh. Thank you, Gary, for chairing this session. So I'm happy to, you know, I've been working for this fantastic week. So it seems to me that, I mean, my impression is that this week testifies to how large is our community, how connected is our community, how international is our community, and also how young is our community. So about 40% of 780 registered participants were PhD students. So I mean, you see probably their face and they talk, and so it's really, it has been an amazing week. So I'd like to thank you first of all and Gary and the ASA staff and team for supporting this event. I'd like to thank you, Josh, for giving us the opportunity to have this kind of brilliant closing lecture. And I would like also to take the chance to thank my Behave team, and especially this gentleman, Federico. You see the face around there. And Federico, thank you very much for helping me with this event. And we are doing well. And without you, it would be impossible to run all this kind of stuff. And well, you know, you will receive an email from me in the next few days with instructions about where to find videos, and let's also hope that this kind of 780 people will at some point subscribe to ASA and become our members, and help us to promote social simulation even more in the future. So thank you. It's been a great week. I'd be very happy to work for this event. So thank you very much.
Thank you from all of us, really. And Gary, thank you very much.
The force is with us.
Thank you all.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you, Federico.
Take care.
Well done.
Thank you all.
Thank you for the very kind words. It's been an honor.
Seems you are enjoying already.
Well, actually, I was kicked out of my office.
Good for you, man.
All right.
Okay.